Gunabandha vidatesham kartrutvam tannivartanam gatitraya swamulatvam chaturdasha udiryate. This is the summary shloka of the 14th chapter of the Gita from Yamunacharya's Gitartha Sangraha. Gunabandha vidha. Gunabandha vidha, the process of how the gunas become the cause for bondage. Tesham kartrutvam, how the gunas of Prakriti become the drivers for actions. Tannivartanam, how to overcome the force of the three gunas. Gatitraya swamulatvam, how Bhagavan alone is the cause for all the three kinds of rewards. Aishwarya, Kaivalya, Bhagavat Prapti. Gunabandha vidatesham kartrutvam tannivartanam gatitraya swamulatvam chadurdasha udiryate. The 14th chapter, as we all know, Gunatraya Vibhaga Yoga, examines in detail the nature of Prakriti, the three gunas, in order to explain the root cause of samsara. And in that process, we also get to know how we can overcome the force of these three gunas. We are about to begin the 13th chapter of the 11th skandha. The Uddhava Gita starts from the 7th chapter of the 11th skandha. The 7th chapter focused on the refinement of the heart. Chapters 8 and 9 focused on the refinement of the senses. Chapters 10 and 11 focused on the refinement of action. Chapter 12 focused on the refinement of intelligence, buddhi. The 13th chapter continues the same theme in the Uddhava Gita. Focus on the refinement of intelligence, buddhi. And interestingly, 13th chapter of the 11th skandha complements the 14th chapter of the Gita, Gunatraya Vibhaga Yoga. In his conversation with Uddhava, Krishna takes up how to refine one's intelligence. And that was the theme throughout the 12th chapter. And he continues the 13th chapter now, where the focus is now on how, by understanding the three gunas, we can actually refine the buddhi. While here in the Uddhava Gita, Krishna complements his teachings in the 14th chapter, we also get to understand more on how we can actually cultivate sattva. While in the 14th chapter, Krishna does talk about the necessity of cultivating sattva, the necessity of overcoming the forces of tamas and rajas. It is only later in the 17th chapter of the Gita, once again Krishna takes up the topic of how do we re-engineer our mind and how do we strengthen our sattva. Here, Krishna brings up the topic of not only the three gunas, but he also beautifully gives us a framework as to how we can go about cultivating sattva. Where do we begin? Where does this journey begin of the cultivation of sattva? How do we make progress? Because we always have these questions. We are all admixture of all the three gunas. And all three gunas are always conflicting with each other. Now, how do we actually strengthen sattva? When rajas and tamas are equally, if not more powerful and overpowering, where does this process begin? And once we begin this process in this journey, how do we actually make progress? And more importantly, how do we sustain progress? So here, Krishna deeps dive into cultivation of sattva. He gives us a nice framework for us so that it becomes more complementary to what we already know from the 14th chapter of the Gita. Towards the end of 14th chapter of the Gita, Krishna gives us a hint. How do we not only cultivate sattva, but eventually how do we transcend sattva as well? Because ultimately all the three gunas of Prakriti have to be transcended. Mamchayo avyabhicharena bhakti yogena sevate. Sagunan samatityaitan brahma bhuyaya kalpate. A simple answer he gives. How do I transcend all the three gunas of Prakriti? One simple answer is bhakti yoga. Interestingly, the answer to the question, how do I master my emotions? The answer is emotion. How do I master my material emotions? The answer is spiritual emotion. Because emotion, by definition, is a disturbance in the mind. That is why it is emotion. Motion is a disturbance in the mind. But the spiritual emotion, which is bhakti, is different from the material emotion. How do we understand material emotion? When the motion is directed towards matter, when the motion is directed towards the external world, it is material emotion. When the same motion is directed towards Krishna, it becomes bhakti, spiritual emotion. So material emotion is like a centrifugal force. Centrifugal force, those of us who understand, who remember physics school days, centrifugal force essentially is a force that pushes outward. So material emotion pushes the mind outward, the consciousness outward, always from the center. We are always at the periphery. Whereas spiritual emotion is like a centripetal force, where the force is towards the center, to the core. Spiritual emotion, bhakti, pulls. Material emotion pushes away from the center. Spiritual emotion, bhakti, pushes one towards the center, to the core, to our place where we rest blissfully with Krishna, where the Jivatma is together with the Paramatma. That's the core, that's our essence. So Krishna concludes the 14th chapter by giving us a way, a means to transcend all the three gunas. Now, in a way, here in the Uddhava Gita, he continues on the same note. Sattvam rajastamayiti guna buddherna chatmanaha sattvena anyatamau hanyat sattvam sattvena chaivahi. Bhagavanu vacha. Krishna begins the 13th chapter. You must remember, Krishna in the 12th chapter already started talking about how do we refine our intelligence. So therefore, when he is talking of the three gunas, he is only confining the discussion to the intelligence. Obviously, the entire body-mind complex is a product of the three gunas. The body is a product of three gunas. Mind is product of three gunas. Intelligence is product of three gunas. The content in the mind, the vasanas, is product of the three gunas. Ego is a product of the three gunas. So in a way, this entire stack, body-mind complex, is a product of three gunas. But here the focus is on buddhi, intelligence. And therefore, he says, Sattvam rajas tamayiti guna buddher na chatmanaha. They belong to the realm of buddhi, not to the Atman. Essentially, we identify with the gunas. We are constantly in a state of misidentification. Because we are identified with the gunas, we think we always see the world through the lens of the three gunas. Depending on the admixture of the three gunas in the mind, we are always engaging with the world through the lens of the three gunas. Because we are misidentified, Krishna once again points out, we are not the three gunas. The three gunas belong to Prakriti. Now, the Atman is Nirguna, is above the three gunas. Now, specifically, they belong to the realm of the buddhi here. Now, why he is taking that up? When we say buddhi, buddhi gives us the power of discrimination. Buddhi gives us the power of decision making. Now, when the gunas operate in that realm, our decision making, our ability to discriminate gets colored by the three gunas. So therefore, when we operate in our life and living, the decisions that we take, the choices that we make, most often are unconscious choices, unconscious decisions, because it's the gunas who are taking the decisions on our behalf. We are programmed in a certain way. We think we keep taking decisions in our life, but if we closely examine, a bulk of the decisions that we take are all programmed. They are all run by our gunas. We are even unaware that we are compelled to make these choices. And therefore, it is the gunas which operate. Gunas are like the settings in the mind. So depending on the nature of the setting, the kind of choices that we make changes. Also, our ability to discriminate what is right, what is wrong is also colored by the gunas. So therefore, Krishna says, Sattvam Rajas Tamaiti Guna Buddhirna Chatmanaha. Then he says, Sattvena Anyatamo Hanyat. This already he covered in detail in the 14th chapter. Sattvena Anyatamo Hanyat. Now, how do I overcome tamas and rajas? I have to overcome tamas and rajas with the help of sattva. Now, this is where we need to understand that we can't fight tamas. We can't fight rajas. Why do I say that? Both tamas and rajas have a grip on us. Now, how do we loosen that grip? Now, we cannot fight darkness with any tools. Darkness can be fought only when we light the lamp. Now, which means tamas loses its grip when there is awareness. Until there is awareness, tamas always has a hold on us. The moment the question arises, what am I doing? In that awareness, suddenly tamas is shaken, inertia is shaken. No, we are always in an autopilot mode, doing things or not doing things. In the case of tamas, be it procrastinating, being lethargic, not really giving our entire attention onto something. All these dullness, all these are characteristics of tamas, and we are in an autopilot mode here. Unless we bring in awareness and question, it is in that awareness tamas begins to crack. So tamas cannot be fought without awareness. And sattva, when we say overcome tamas with sattva, sattva brings that awareness. It is that ability to ask a question. All of us would have experienced this. If we ask one question, now I want to postpone what has to be done today to tomorrow. The moment I ask the question, why am I doing this? It is in asking that very question, in my awareness that I am actually postponing something, that itself is a beginning of how I can overcome that force of lethargy. So awareness, because most often we are not even aware. The tamasic state is such that we are in a state of darkness and dullness. So tamas loosens its grip with awareness. Similarly, rajas is movement without any orientation. How do I overcome the force of rajas? I have to give some direction, which means I have to give it some clarity. Now, the moment I ask the question, what is the consequence of my action? That question unsettles rajas, because rajas is about activity without reflection on the consequences, without contemplation on the consequences. So how do I unsettle rajas? By bringing in clarity. So tamas loses its grip with awareness. Rajas loses its grip, becomes unsettling when I bring in clarity. So that is why sattva plays a very important role. Now, how does sattva rise? Sattva does not rise. We cannot grow sattva. Essentially, sattva is not generated. Sattva is borrowed. It's like when I take a cold iron rod and I place it closer to fire. It's just a matter of time before the rod catches the heat. Sattva is like that. That is why Krishna is constantly emphasizing the need for satsang. Because sattva is borrowed. Sattva is shaped by our environment, is shaped by our association. And it is only there. It's not generated, but it is borrowed, it is kindled. And it is with sattva that clarity arises. Clarity is refined, awareness arises. And this is how we can actually, sattvena anyatamau hanyat. How do I overcome the force of tamas and rajas? When sattva rises. When sattva rises, awareness rises. When sattva rises, clarity dawns. And clarity manages rajas, gives orientation to our action. Actions that we do suddenly get a new meaning, a new direction. It becomes less and less rajasic and more sattvic. And even our lethargy, even our lack of movement gets some meaning when there is awareness. So even sleep becomes meaningful provided there is awareness as to why we are actually taking that break, why we are actually sleeping. So sleep is no longer a lethargic exercise. Sleep becomes regaining energy, also staying still. This is, we always, we have seen this. There is a very thin line between sattva and tamas. Outwardly, meditation and lazily sitting there daydreaming may seem one and the same. There is a thin line. So essentially, the difference is awareness. So sattvena anyatamau hanyat. Sattvam sattvena chaivahi. Ultimately, how do I then eventually transcend sattva? Krishna says by sattva. No, the characteristic of sattva is in such a way that while it helps us overcome the grip of tamas and rajas, eventually sattva on its own loosens its own grip. No, this is the beauty of sattva. Because once there is clarity, once there is light, nothing else is needed. And that's how Krishna takes us to the next shloka. We see how sattva eventually helps us overcome sattva. Now he explains that. Sattvat dharmo bhavet vriddhat. Pumso mad bhakti lakshanaha. Satvikaha upasaya sattvam tato dharma pravartate. He beautifully lays down the steps as to how tataha dharmaha pravartate. Essentially, how we can lead a life rooted in dharma. How can life be successfully led based on dharma? He says, Sattvat dharmo bhavet vriddhat. From sattva, as sattva starts growing, as sattva is strengthened, dharmo bhavet vriddhat. Dharma arises. Now, what is dharma here? What happens when sattva grows? When sattva grows, there is clarity. What do we mean by clarity? The intelligence is illumined. When the intelligence is illumined, we are able to see clearly, cut through. Now, one of the functions of the intelligence is like a knife that can cut through the layers of reality. And then as we, with an illumined intelligence, we would be able to see reality as is. Here, dharma is not just the right thing to do. Dharma, our nature, our true identity. Sattva reveals our true identity. What is our true identity? As Atman, as the soul, our true identity is nothing but to be blissfully loving Krishna. So therefore, Pumsaha madbhakti lakshanaha, immediately he says. So the moment dharma is revealed, dharma arises, immediately what is the characteristic of this dharma? Savai pumsam paro dharmo yato bhaktir adhokshaje ahaituki aprasikatata yata bhaktir adhokshaje. Shuka, right at the beginning of Bhagavatam, answers this question. What is my dharma? Is the question all the sages of Naimisharanya ask. He says the ultimate dharma, paradharma, is bhakti to adhokshaja, bhakti to Krishna. So Krishna here is saying, Sattvat dharmo bhaved vriddhat pumsaha mad bhakti lakshanaha. Dharma is revealed, dharma grows, arises when sattva is strengthened. There is clarity. And when dharma arises, what is the characteristic of dharma? Pumsaha madbhakti lakshanaha. That dharma carries the fragrance of love for Krishna, bhakti. So, dharma essentially is doing bhakti to Krishna. Bhakti is the signature of the Atman. So when dharma matures, we realize that there is no other business other than to love Bhagavan. So therefore, the byproduct of sattva rising, growing, is this revelation of our own true identity. Ultimately, only when we are rooted in our identity, that knowledge of our identity then shapes our action. And then the action determines our destination. So therefore, why sattva is important? Because it reveals our own destiny and our own identity, and that identity is characterized by bhakti. Sattvika upasaya sattvam tato dharma pravartate. Now Krishna beautifully says, the second part of the shloka, he says, Sattvika upasaya sattvam tato dharma pravartate. Now, in order for me to continue leading my life rooted in dharma, on the knowledge of my dharma, I need to do upasana. Sattvika upasana, he says. Now, the question that we immediately ask is, do I do upasana after I completely overpower the forces of rajas and tamas and wait for sattva to eventually become strong, or I start now? Now, the reason why we ask that question is we are waiting to get the answer saying, no, you have to wait. No, Krishna is not asking us to wait. If we keep waiting, we will only be waiters. We will never be worshippers. Now, here, therefore, Sattvika upasaya. Sattvika upasaya, essentially the upasana that we do can start anytime, anywhere. Even when we are predominantly rajasic and tamasic, we have to bring ourselves to doing upasana, where trying to listen more than arguing. Trying to keep ourselves associated with satsanga, trying to be there where the environment is conducive for the mind to be less agitated. Now, all these come under Sattvika upasana. It is not just worship. Wherever we try and manage to bring the agitation in the mind down, make the mind little bit calmer, anything that can induce calmness goes into upasana. So therefore, I don't wait for the right moment to come. No, I don't wait for an inspiration to come and then I will start worshipping Krishna. Inspiration will come later. But before inspiration, there has to be perspiration. If there is perspiration, inspiration will automatically come. So here he's saying, therefore, satvikopasaya sattvam tato dharma pravartate. So essentially, choose practices that calm you, that soften your mind, that clarify something. Do worship that brings down agitation. That is the reason why all our rituals, the pujas that we do, the japa that we do, all of this are essentially meant for this purpose. We have certain prescriptions for any puja that needs to be done, prescriptions for any japa that needs to be done. All these are aimed only for this. Even when I am in a state of restlessness, that is our natural state many days. We are many times restless, or we are very dull and lethargic. If we can bring ourselves to engage in any ritual, it could be a japa, it could be it could be chanting a mantra, it could be even listening to a discourse, or it could be even just being there when a group of people are discussing something very profound about Krishna. Any such thing would have an effect of calming the mind down. So the start can be anywhere, anytime. It is all about trying to create a window in the mind for sattva to start growing slowly. So therefore he says, Satvikopasaya sattvam tato dharma pravartate. As this goes on, what happens over a period of time? Obviously sattva will ascend, and the awareness that will come with it will take care of tamas, and the clarity that comes with it will take care of rajas. And then Krishna says, Dharmo rajas tamo hanyat sattva vriddhir anuttamaha asu nashyati tanmulaha yadharmaha ubhaye hate. Says, thus strengthened by sattva, when we do our dharma, our kainkarya, our duty, what it does, sattva vriddhir anut rajas tamo hanyat, it will take care of vanquishing rajas and tamas. Something more interesting is also going to happen. Ashu nashyati tanmulaha tanmulahi adharma ubaye hate. Krishna uses the word adharma here for punya and papa. Not only rajas and tamas are countered, punya and papa, which are the root for rajas and tamas, are also vanquished, he says, which essentially means karma becomes nishkarma. So I stop accumulating more punya and papa. The very foundation that is responsible for rajas and tamas to keep growing, which is essentially by punya papa complex, that's completely vanquished, he says. Now the question comes. Now this is where Krishna now takes us into a beautiful structure of how do I re-architect my mind, specifically my intelligence, my buddhi, refine it. How do I cultivate sattva? Now, he talks about 10 ways. Krishna is once again makes it simple here. He says, there is only one way we can manage and master the three gunas. Well, there is one way we can cultivate sattva, by architecting the inputs that go to us, inside us. Essentially, it is all about what goes in. And there are 10 ways Krishna takes up. Agamaha, apaha, praja, deshaha, kalaha, karmacha, janmacha, dhyanam, mantraha, atha, samskaraha, dashaite gunahetavaha. 10 causes, 10 reasons, 10 ways these gunas are architected. So 10 ways, the three. One is, we already come with an admixture of three gunas. But Krishna now gives 10 ways how these three gunas can actually change, get reconstituted in our life and living. What are those? Agamaha, apaha, praja, deshaha, kalaha, karma, janma, dhyana, mantra, samskara. These are the 10. Dashaite gunahetavaha. Agamaha. Agama, what you treat as authority. Essentially, Agama, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Itihasas, the Puranas. Essentially, what you trust. Where is your belief? Where do beliefs come from? What is the source for your beliefs? That is one major factor that shapes the three gunas. The belief systems sculpt the mind. That's the reason why, if we do not have exposure to the right agama, to the right wisdom texts, then we can never sculpt our mind in the right fashion. So agama becomes very important. That is what you treat as authority. Second, apaha. Apaha means water that we consume, but here apaha stands for everything that we consume. Apaha is a symbolic here. Essentially, the food that we consume, the media that we consume, the conversations that we consume, the information that we consume, everything that goes through our senses inside us shapes our mind. You don't think your way into clarity, you digest your way into clarity. This is very important, because what goes in and what is digested, that is the reason why food is such an important ingredient. In the 17th chapter of the Gita, Krishna takes up the importance of food. There is no point in saying why I am not becoming sattvic if I do not take care of what I consume as food. Because I am what my food is, as simple as that. Now, when we say food, now we have to expand it further. It is not just what goes in through the mouth. Everything that goes inside through our eyes, what we see, what we hear, every stimuli, the stimuli that we consume goes and sculpts and shapes our mind. Therefore, apaha, what we consume and what we digest, especially in today's digital world, we are even more in a dangerous situation because knowingly or unknowingly, we are exposed to so much of digital stimuli which goes in shaping our mind. And therefore, apaha, what we consume. Krishna is listing various causes that can reconstitute the admixture of sattva, rajas, tamas here. Agamaha, apaha, praja. Praja stands for the people around, the family, my colleagues, my friends, my social circles, because gunas are contagious. We must be aware of this. If I am with somebody rajasic for a long time, and we have experienced this, if somebody is restless and always constantly wanting to do something all the time, in their presence, we are also compelled to act. If we are in the company of people who are lazy, lethargic, always postponing things, eventually there is a danger that we too become lethargic. If you are in the company of sattvic people, we also become sattvic. So praja, the people around, proximity is so very important, has a big impact on our own constitution of the gunas. Agamaha, apaha, praja, deshaha, environment. Environment, home, environment in the place where we are, workplace, outside of the workplace, and these days we must also add digital space. Digital space becomes now more important because most often we are in the virtual world than the real world. So the kind of virtual world we live in plays a huge role shaping our own gunas. Unfortunately, the virtual world is designed in such a way to strengthen our rajas and tamas. This is the nature of the content that is being served in the virtual world. So we must be very careful in terms of what kind of content digitally we are consuming on a daily basis. So then we have kala, time. Here, kala also plays a very important role. The time of the day, kala also the stage of life also plays a very important role. Because at different stages, we do different kinds of activities. The pace of our life and living, rhythm plays a very important role. All of us possibly would have experienced this. When we shape our days and our weeks and our months in a particular way by making rhythmic, we grow sattva. How do we know that? Our ability to have a clear and calm mind. When I know that is the reason why all our schools call it teach. How do you plan how do you put a structure? How do you actually look at all the activities that you do and you place them in buckets where you can have a nice pattern so that there is lesser chaos. There is a visibility in terms of an order so that you are not agitated. You're not jumping from one thing and to the other. No, this is about how do you manage your calendar? How do you manage the time? How do you make it rhythmic? And also, how do you place activities in buckets depending on their priorities, depending on your own energy levels during the time of the day? Obviously, we don't place something so very important and critical just after lunch. We know that because possibly we will not be able to give our best. So time, kala, plays a very important role in influencing the kind of guna. Because after a heavy lunch, if we have a critical meeting and we start yawning, tamas obviously is going to be predominant there. How do I then map the criticality of what I do with the guna that I would want to be dominant? Rhythm becomes so very important. Therefore, kala is very important. Agamaha, apaha, praja, desha, kala, karma. Karma here, what I repeatedly do. Whether we realize it or not, intentionally or unintentionally, we are repeating every day. Now, you just have to look at from the morning we wake up to the time we go to sleep. Just examine all the activities we do. We are typically repeating ourselves. Most of our actions are repeats. This is essentially, without knowing, we are tuning the mind in a particular way. This is also shaping the gunas accordingly. So we must also look at what we are constantly repeating. If we are constantly repeating a rajasic activity, obviously it is going to contribute to increasing rajas. So karma plays a very important. Janma is inherited tendencies. Now, this is something we cannot avoid. This is something which we already inherited. Our temperament, our conditioning. But luckily for us, Krishna is clear. These inherited tendencies are only starting points. They need not be final points, ending points. The starting points can always change. So, but we must be aware of these inherited tendencies. Sometimes, or most often, we are also unaware or we don't recognize these inherited tendencies. That awareness of these tendencies is so very important. So, some amount of self-reflection helps in recognizing our own inherent tendencies, our own the mixture of how much of sattva, how much of tamas, how much of rajas we have. Then dhyana. Dhyana here is what we dwell on. All of us have our own homepage. Whatever we do, we go back to the homepage. And what is that homepage? That is what we most spend our thoughts around. Essentially, when we have nothing else to do, where does our thoughts gravitate towards? Now, when we are very busy doing many things, possibly we are not aware. But when the busyness comes down, where do these thoughts gravitate towards? It's very important for us to examine and reflect, because that tells us what is our natural dhyana. Obviously, it is not Krishna dhyana. It is some other dhyana. It can be stock market dhyana, it can be food dhyana, it can be any. So it depends again on how our consciousness is consumed, what consumes our consciousness. So dhyana becomes very important. That is the reason why attention is the most precious resource, especially in today's world. Because what we give our attention to in our lives, that grows. If I give attention to my worries, worries grow. If I give attention to Krishna, Krishna grows in my life, within my consciousness. So dhyana, therefore, is so very important. It shapes the gunas. Dhyana, mantra. Mantra, chanting the mantras. Because sound, the shabda has a very important role to play in reorganizing our mind. We have also experienced this. When we do meditation, when we do visualization around a mantra, the shabda has the power to reorganize our mind so that the mind can calm down, sattva can rise. The sacredness of the shabda is so very significant. It can purify, it can bring order to the mind. Our thought patterns can be managed. When we chant a mantra repeatedly, all the negative thoughts will slowly settle and get washed away. And we have experienced. So mantra also plays a very important role. Tatha samskaraha. Samskara are habits. Habits. We need to look at what our habits are. Samskaras are the impressions that we make in the mind. Everything that we do makes an impression. Every little act that we do makes an impression. And are we adding more rajas, or are we adding more tamas, or are we adding more sattva with every act of ours? Therefore, what Krishna is saying, that it's not about conquering the gunas. Looking at these 10 different causes that Krishna lists out, we can starve tamas and rajas, and we can feed sattva. Sattva can be nourished, tamas and rajas can be starved. So when we starve rajas and tamas, starving rajas and tamas is somehow stop the input, stop any of these 10 things in terms of instigating rajas and tamas. Manage what we consume well. Manage, look at our habit patterns, look at our time, how we use it. Look at what we listen to, how much we get exposed to the shastras, our association, family, environment. When we look at all of this, we now can see ways and means of how we can nourish, feed sattva, and how we can starve tamas and rajas. And then he goes on and he gives a beautiful analogy in terms of how actually liberation can happen with the ascent, not conquering the two gunas with sattva and eventually transcending sattva. Venu sangharshajo vannihi dhagdva samyati tadvanam evam guna vyatyaja dehaha samyati tatkriyaha. He gives an example. Just visualize a bamboo forest. A bamboo forest filled with bamboo trees, and when two bamboo trees come together and there is friction happens, that friction of the two bamboo creates fire. And that fire eventually is aided by the wind, slowly spreads. Other bamboo trees catch fire, the trunks catch fire, all the leaves, everything on the ground, everything catches fire. The entire forest catches fire. Eventually, the entire forest is consumed. Once the entire forest is consumed, there is no need for the fire. The fire by itself subsides. Once everything is consumed, the fire also subsides completely. So he gives that analogy and he says, when the gunas, the interplay of the gunas, the friction of the three gunas results in this body, mind, intelligence mechanism, which is like the fire, which is used to consume and exhaust karma. And eventually, it is the same fire which consumes everything, and after the current karma is exhausted, it is the same body-mind complex which, acting as fire, consumes everything. When everything is consumed, when the utility of the body ceases, then it too drops and rests. There is no more need for any more fire. So, with the example where one can transcend all the three gunas, the body is a product of three gunas, but it is the same body, it is the same mind, it is the same intelligence which helps us to transcend the three gunas. So he gives this example of the bamboo tree. Now Uddhava has a very interesting question. He's asking this question on our behalf. Vidanti, and it's quite a striking question. Uddhava, unlike Arjuna, asks questions which are very punchy here. He asks, Vidanti martyah prayena vishayan padam apadam tatapi bhunjate Krishna tat katam swa karajavat. Vidanti martyah prayena. Most human, Vidanti martyah, all the human beings, most of the human beings know in general Vishayan Padam Apadam, that sense objects are the very doorway to calamity. This is known. Essentially what he's saying, even after we get knowledge, we get jnana, after the intelligence is refined, it becomes clear what is right and wrong. It becomes clear that the sense objects are eventually doorway to more troubles. It is known. Knowledge has already arrived. But he says, Tathapi bhunjate Krishna. Then why do they still go around in indulgence? So essentially the question is, after even knowing what is right, why do people keep committing what is wrong? And he adds, he says, Tathapi bhunjate Krishna tat katam swa khara aja vat. He does not just say, why do they keep going, indulging in all the wrong things? He says, why do they still indulge like swa, dogs, khara, donkeys, aja, goats? He doesn't say just like animals. He specifically uses the three examples. The reason why he uses the example. He could have said why human beings still behave in an animalistic fashion. But he specifies dog, a donkey, and a goat. The dog here, swa, essentially dog stands for obsessive pursuit. It just reacts to everything obsessively. There is no reflection. It is compulsively chasing things. Throw a bone, it jumps, right? It compulsively chasing desires. Donkey, stubborn, it's repetitive, it is burdened, repeating the same mistakes again and again. So he uses the example of a donkey. Goat, easily tempted, jumping here and there, lacks in any discrimination. Just before the slaughter, if it is offered grass, it is happily consuming grass without knowing it is going to be slaughtered. Lack of discrimination, scattered attention. So essentially what Uddhava is saying here, even after sattva refines intelligence, discrimination starts to happen. One is able to see what is right, what is wrong. One has the knowledge of why one must not go about obsessed with in material indulgences. But still, why do people continue on the same path? Why do people keep doing wrongs even when they know what is right? So the question is, why there is a disconnect between knowing and doing? Now, knowing is happening. What is right and what is wrong? It is the classic case of Duryodhana. He says, I know what is right, but somehow I am compelled to do what I am doing, right? In many ways, there is a Duryodhana in each and every one of us. Most often, we have crystal clarity, of what is right and wrong, but somehow there is that compulsive force which makes us repeatedly do wrong things again and again and again. So Uddhava therefore asks Krishna on our behalf, and Bhagavan, he gives a beautiful explanation. He says, Aham iti anyata buddhihi pramattasya yata hridi utsarpati rajo ghoram tato vaikarikam manaha rajoyuktasya manasaha sankalpasa vikalpagaha tata kamo gunadhyanat dussaha syaddi durmatehe. Says, Ahamiti anyata buddhihi. Now, even if sattva refines buddhi is only for discrimination, right and wrong. But we still have a storage of vasanas, which is where our habit patterns are sitting securely. Even if buddhi knows what is right and wrong, the force of the vasanas are very strong. Vasanas are sitting in manas. No, we must once again go back and look at the complex called the mind, where what we call as mind is essentially as manas, which is the supervisor of the senses, buddhi, which is the analytical discriminatory agency, then we have ahankara, the ego, and we have chitta, which is the storage where all the vasanas, all the impressions are sitting. Now, even if buddhi is refined, even if buddhi knows what is right or wrong, now manas, if it is weak, and if ego takes over, ahamiti anyata buddhihi, ego driven misperception, where I am the doer, I control. When that happens, pramattasya yada hridi, there is lack of awareness. Pramatta means distraction. In today's world, we can call it multitasking, because we all, unfortunately, we glorify multitasking without realizing multitasking is a big bane. The more multitasking we do, the more disservice we do to ourselves in terms of our ability to do justice to what we do. So multitasking and distraction are one and the same thing. Multitasking is training our mind to be distracted all the time. And when the mind is in a state of distraction, even if we know what is right or wrong, even if buddhi is refined, the habit patterns will go on their own. They are not managed well. Therefore, utsarpati rajo ghoram. And he says, the rajasic energy flows in the mind. Desire and attachment they grow in the mind. Tato vaikarikam manaha. The mind becomes restless. The mind becomes restless. The desires take over, the vasanas, the habit patterns continue. even if the intelligence knows what is right and wrong, then he says sankalpa, rajoyuktasya manasaha sankalpaha. Even the rajasic mind bound by attachment, the mind cannot, it just goes where our attachment directs. Even though we know what is right and what is wrong, if you are attached to something strongly, that pulls us in that direction. Buddhi is saying, no, don't go there, it is wrong. But the attachment is so strong, the mind is restless, the vasana is strong, we are pulled towards that. Savikalpaha. Also, the mind will create emotional hooks around the outcome, and therefore we ignore Buddhi saying, no, this is wrong, because we are pulled and we start fantasizing about the outcomes. The mind is great in imagination. Tataha kamo gunadhyanaha. Once we get pulled in the direction, then the mind is consumed by doing meditation on the object which is pulling it, and become dussahasyadi dhurmate. This is where we become obsessively compelled. This is the force. Rajas therefore takes over completely, that we end up doing actions. So in a way, how can we simplify this and understand? Our habits can be understood as a cycle of 3 B's: behavior trigger, behavior benefit. To simplify this whole thing, anything that we do is a cycle. Our habits are circular patterns. There is a behavior trigger. This trigger is our vasanas. And the vasanas get triggered by stimuli. It can be external, it can be internal. Now this trigger triggers the behavior. Now, when the trigger is so strong, even when the intelligence says whether it says it is wrong, the strength of the trigger forces one compelling into behavior. And why is that behavior happening? Because of a benefit. Because we are always looking for an outcome, a result, a benefit. Now, the benefit is an experience, and it is also an impression in the mind. Therefore, it is a cycle. So every time we experience an outcome, we are also adding to our mental impression. So this is the cycle. Behavior trigger, behavior benefit. This benefit is nothing but an experience, good or bad, with an impression that once again adds. Either it adds to an existing impression, which strengthens it or weakens it, or creates a new impression. The cycle goes on and on. Now, if we don't do anything, the cycle will go on. That is the reason why we can never break our habits. That is the reason why, we think we can start a new habit and then we fail, because our existing habits have been going on, not created in this lifetime. It's been on based on our vasanas that we have inherited. So we are all products of our own habits. And this is a cyclic pattern that goes on and on. So that is the reason why, to Uddhava's question, Krishna says, even when intelligence is refined, even when sattva grows and intelligence is able to discriminate right and wrong, knowing right and wrong alone is not enough. There is still a disconnect between knowing and doing, because your doing is essentially the force of your habits. Your doing is essentially the force of your habits. Now, how do I remove this disconnection? How do I connect my knowing and doing? How do I bridge? So Krishna then gives 7-point framework. Now, he starts by saying, when there is a trigger, now immediately there has to be awareness. Notice the trigger before the trigger becomes an action. When a stimuli, outside object triggers interest, triggers the vasana in me, immediately notice it. Most often we don't even notice. The moment we notice, bring it in our awareness, that itself will stop that trigger becoming an action. Number one, awareness in the moment. Second, he says, regularly practice regulation of prana. This is where all the yoga sadhanas, the meditation, the pranayama, what prana has to do with, in this process. When prana is regulated, When you calm the energy forces, it calms the mind. Because prana and the mind are interrelated. Because if my prana is not, if my breath is not regulated well, I cannot manage the state of my mind. That is the reason when we do pranayama, we automatically experience calmness of the mind. So he says prana regulation, number 2. 3, he says sense discipline, reduce overstimulation. While willpower is important, don't keep trying to test your willpower alone. Also manage your overstimulation. Unnecessarily don't expose yourself to everything and anything. If I have to open one browser, just keep one browser open. Don't open 20 different browsers. And there are pop-ups coming from all the different browsers. And one of the browsers, one of the pop-ups will suddenly catch my attention and will drag me away completely. As much as possible, manage my environment and stimulation, because we are today in a era of overstimulation. Our senses are bombarded with stimuli. This has to be reduced. So sense discipline becomes so very important. We may say that, no, I have strong willpower. Even if we have strong willpower, sometimes at that particular time, the tamas in us or the rajas in us can compel us to indulge. So therefore, sense discipline becomes important. 4, drop doership, because it is that kartrutva buddhi where the ego takes over, where then immediately identification with the gunas happen. So therefore, drop doership. 5, replace this loop. Don't suppress. In the same habit pattern, start with sattvic routines. Behavior trigger, behavior benefit. So the same, how we are in a vicious circle, introduce virtuous circles. Take some routines which are sattvic in nature, because sometimes it's very difficult for us to give up bad habits. It is, if we bring in a good habit, it will weaken a bad habit. So here, replace the loop, don't suppress, install. Then 6, shift the reward. This is where Mamchayo abhyavicharena bhakti yogena sevate. The reward of bhakti, the bliss of connecting with Krishna. If the mind can be motivated to be attracted to Krishna, that would then change the habit pattern. And 7, daily repetition. Essentially, ensure that constantly you practice the simple routines again and again and again and again. So essentially, Krishna here, in answering Uddhava, how do I build the bridge between my knowing and my doing? Now, with sattva, I refine my intelligence. I start knowing what is right, what is wrong. I start gaining clarity. I start gaining knowledge. But still, I have the problem of my habit patterns. I have my vasanas which are so strong, where actions are often happening without my conscious intention. Most of our actions are unconsciously happening. So I need to recognize this habit cycle, and I need to work on that habit cycle in such a way that I change this routine also into a sattvic routine. Then I bridge these two, knowing and doing. So sattva in my intelligence and sattvic routines, bring them together, and that is when my knowledge then translates and transforms into doing. Knowing and doing become complementary. So that is when Krishna says, when you know what is right, you will end up doing what is right. And when you do what is right, it strengthens what you know is right. And this is symbiotic. And that is when sattva in the intelligence, sattva in the mind, and sattvic inputs and sattvic actions all together will ensure that one stays on course and one travels. Now, as Krishna says this, Uddhava has another question. Can you give me more knowledge on this process of how I can go about bringing about a change to my habit patterns? How do I reprogram myself? How do I bring in more sattvic vasanas? How do I clean my current vasanas, which are rajasic and tamasic in mind? And Krishna's answer is so very beautiful and profound. Krishna says, let me not give you an answer now. I will go back in time and I will narrate an answer I had earlier given to the Sanat Kumaras. He says, long time back, Sanat Kumaras had a similar question. They asked their father Brahma, and at that time Brahma was contemplating on how to answer them. At that moment, I descended into Satyaloka, taking the beautiful, glorious avatara as Hamsa. And as Hamsa avatara, I instructed Sanat Kumaras. So therefore, let me narrate that beautiful conversation that happened between me as Hamsa and the Sanat Kumaras in response to your question. So Krishna is going to now describe Hamsa avatara and the teachings of Hamsa avatara in the rest of the chapter, which we will continue the next week. Until then, let us contemplate on how sattva, when it arises, will, as awareness, will weaken the grip of tamas. And when it arises as clarity, unsettles rajas. And let us reflect on the 10 causes that influence and impact the 3 gunas, the constitution of our own mental makeup, and how by looking at each of these 10 causes, we can actually engineer the constitution in our minds, how we can grow sattva, how we can cultivate sattva. Sarvam Sri Krishnarpanamastu.